Welcome to the Hockey Writers Fantasy Forecheck, where we talk to you about all things fantasy, keeper league, redraft, and dynasty. We're going to give you hot players to pick up, prospects on the rise, and sleepers you should or shouldn't think of acquiring, as well as prospects who are looking to break out at the NHL level. I'm your host, Caleb Kerney.
And I am Jake Strozyk.
Our topic today will be all about retooling versus rebuilding. What approach should you take to turn your team into a contender? Excited for this one today. Jacob, we got some hot players to talk about. Why don't you tell the people about some of the guys that impressed you this last week?
Yeah, we're going to start off with probably one of the biggest fish from the trade deadline. We're going to talk about Rasmus Sandin. Got traded to the Washington Capitals, and since then, he has been the definition of a firecracker. The guy has just been lighting everything up. Since John Carlson's been out, he's been their number one D by far. The guy has just been eating up minutes. The other night, he played literally just under 30 minutes. Definitely a career high for him.
Yeah.
Since he's been traded there, he has 3 multi-point games. He has a total of 8 points in his last 4 games since he got traded. And the guy is just doing literally everything above and beyond probably what they were expecting. But as far as fantasy is concerned, if you didn't grab him the minute he got traded to Washington and he's somehow still on your waiver wire, he was on mine a couple of days ago, so there's still a chance he might be on yours. Grab him before anybody else can even think about it, because he's just going to keep doing this. Maybe not at the same exact pace, but he's going to keep putting up points in the way that he's been playing with Washington.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, if you are listening to this right now, stop, press pause, look at your leagues, see if he's available. If he is, pick him up. If he's sitting on somebody's bench, maybe throw a trade proposal their way. You want Rasmus Sandin. Jacob nailed it. He's been on fire. 8 points in 4 games. He's only played 4 games with Washington so far. 1 goal, 7 assists. So there's still some potential for more goals there. He's not shooting a lot. He's only got 4 shots, but he's got 8 hits, 4 blocks. So that's some decent peripheral coverage. Only 2 of his 7 assists have been on the power play, which is crazy. So that number could increase because, again, this is the same power play that has Backstrom, Ovechkin, right? That lethal shot of Ovechkin's. I'm surprised Sandin doesn't have more power play assists. So there is some potential for growth there, as crazy enough as it is, and especially with the low shot totals for the 4 games. If he shoots more, it's going to be insane. Chewing up minutes, you bet. 21 minutes, 40 seconds. 25 minutes, 6 seconds. 29 minutes, 58 seconds. Let's just call it 30 minutes. And then 23 minutes, 27 seconds. That's what he's been doing lately. Again, top pair. He's young. He's the guy you want. No matter what league you're in, especially if you're in a keeper or a dynasty, pick this guy up. He's the guy you want. Who's the next guy that people should think about having?
Next one to go for Pittsburgh's Jason Zucker. He's been kind of in and out of people's waiver wires throughout the course of the year. He's been kind of streaky, but right now is the point where he's hot. So this is definitely a time where you want to grab him if he's sitting down and somebody dropped him. He's got 6 points in his last 5 games. He's currently on a 3-game goal streak. So goals, always want to grab people who are scoring goals, especially at good rates. And at the same time, he's still playing that kind of second line role. He's getting around 3 shots a game, so he's putting up shots no matter what. His season average is still pretty good. So if you decide to grab him and hold on to him, he might be someone you can kind of shift up and down your bench for a sit-start position. But at the same time, if he is down on the wire where someone's going to let you pick him up and you have the opportunity, grab him while he's hot, because he always maintains that for a good, 5 to 8 game pace.
Absolutely. Last 4 games, 4 goals, 3 shots a game, over 2 hits a game too. He's getting you the hits as well. Zucker has always been a hitter, 10 hits in his past 4 games. So great coverage across the board. Thanks for those guys, Jacob. We got our prospects on the rise now. I got a couple guys who, have already been drafted. First guy I want to talk about, Olen Zellweger. This guy has been on fire this year in the WHL. He was kind of a sneaky pick when he was drafted a couple of years ago. He wasn't as heralded in the I don't want to say the public sphere, but amongst NHL pundits as much as Power and those guys were. But he's sneaky good. Some people say he's a little undersized. I think he's 5'10" or 5'11". He's not undersized. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't consider that undersized, but a stark contrast in terms of the teams that he's played for this year. He got traded at the CHL deadline. He started his season with Everett, and in those 23 games, 10 goals, 18 assists for 28 points. Great production for a guy who's already been in the league. You want at least a point per game for your defenseman. If they can get higher than that, that's even better. And that's exactly what he did after he was traded to Kamloops. In his 25 games so far, 18 goals, 26 assists for 44 points. That's a total of 72 points in 48 games this year. Drysdale better look out in Anaheim because Zellweger is coming for that offensive defender position on that Ducks blue line. Look out for this kid. I think Zellweger is going to overtake Drysdale's power play spot. Drysdale's probably going to be forced to be more of a two-way guy, which doesn't necessarily hurt his fantasy value, but it really skyrockets Zellweger's, in my opinion. Jacob, what do you think?
Yeah, you never want to not pay attention to defensive prospects that put up points. Because when it translates to the NHL, it doesn't always go 100%. He's not going to be throwing up 28 goals in his rookie season or anything like that. But by the time his development ends, he's going to be a good offensive defenseman. So definitely keep an eye out. I'm more interested in the second one you're going to talk about, so I'll let you get right to it.
Yeah, the second guy here is one of Buffalo's own, Jiri Kulich. He's playing in the AHL this year. Last year he played in the Czech men's league, the same league that David Jiricek played in. And so because of the NHL has some silly rules with the CHL in terms of typically 18 and 19-year-olds can't play in the AHL if they come from the CHL, but they can play in the AHL if they come from other leagues. It's an absolutely ridiculous rule that should not even exist because it just sucks. Okay. That's just a simple way to put it. So in his 46 games so far this year, 17 goals, 18 assists for 35 points. Fantastic for Kulich. The name probably sounds familiar. For the Czech team, he was kind of like their go-to goal scorer. They'd set him up on the power play to just score goals in the World Junior Tournament. And this guy, I'll let Jacob rant and rave about this guy. Jacob, what do you think of this guy?
Yeah, Kulich he was definitely one of the best steals in the late draft this past year. I can tell you this much. I've seen the guy play live. He's very much a do-everything type of player. So when he eventually makes it to the NHL, he's not just going to be some role-playing third liner that's going to be, chipping in things here and there. He's going to be a prominent part of Buffalo's offense, or if they decide to move him for any reason whatsoever, whoever he gets moved to offense. I don't think he's on that list of trade, available prospects for Kevin Adams, but Kulich is the type of guy. He throws hits, he scores goals, he puts up points. He's a great leader. He does literally everything on the ice. So if you have the opportunity to grab him in a much deeper dynasty league where you can maybe have the ability to hold on to him, he's not going to be NHL ready by the end of this year. He might be NHL ready by about middle of next year. I don't think he'll make the team right out of camp, but he's on the right development path. to be an impact player, it's just going to take him 1, maybe 2 years at the absolute max because he has the skills, he has the tools, and he's going to be putting up every category of fantasy point that you can possibly imagine. He plays center, he plays wing. So if he's on the wing, he's going to be putting up a lot of shots. If he's at center, he's going to be winning you draws. He's going to be throwing the hits. He's going to be setting up everything. So he's going to have value no matter where you're able to get him. So I know it's a little bit of homer bias to say it, but I think he is just one of the best all-around prospects just in the league today. It's just going to take him a little time.
Yeah. So would you say that, like, if you were to describe his sort of potential, we're looking at, maybe like a top 6 two-way kind of guy, kind of in the mold of like, I don't even really know, like a Horvat or a Taves, where you get category coverage, across your shots, your hits, your blocks, and you get decent points. Maybe he doesn't have quite the ceiling of like a Horvat or a Taves, but that kind of like second line center role, is that something that you could see him kind of filling into?
Yeah, that's about what he is, with the chance that if needed, he can step up to a top unit and do something. His best asset still is his shot. He has an absolute cannon. So I think Horvat is a great comparison for him. Just think the way Horvat plays, but with a way better shot by the time it's fully developed.
Wow, that's fantastic. Some guys who should, maybe think about improving their shots. We got a couple guys on some cold streaks here. Jacob, why don't you tell us about the first one?
Yeah, we'll go right into the forward of the group. We'll talk about Michael Bunting from the Toronto Maple Leafs. Normally, Bunting is a fairly consistent player. He was in the top 6 last year, and he was putting up a good amount of points. He still has a decent amount of points throughout the year, but recently he's on just a big cold streak. He only has 1 point in March so far, and in that same span of time, he only has 4 shots, and that's in his last 5 games. So he's not getting the shots off. He's not scoring points. He's not really getting anything as far as general coverage. He's got like 1 hit per game in that span of time. But beyond that, he's losing ice time as well. He played just over 10 minutes the other night. So with his role kind of decreasing, I'm not saying he's a drop candidate because he still can score goals, but he's definitely a sit versus start option for me.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add on Bunting. In his last 4 games, he's only got 1 goal, 4 shots, 4 hits. That's very meh as far as forwards go. I like to see at least a couple shots a game. The hits is fine, but at least a couple shots a game, to give you a nice sort of points floor or category coverage. Bunting's just not doing that right now. And Jacob, who else isn't doing it right now?
It's going to be Ivan Provorov from the Philadelphia Flyers. Provorov isn't really known for his offensive prowess, but he does chip in offense here and there throughout the course of his career. But right now he's just riding a big cold streak. He only has 1 point since February 18th. So he's gone about a month without really getting any offensive production whatsoever. That's just way too low for a defenseman of his caliber. He has a low shooting total. He's not really generating any shots himself. He is more of a physical style defenseman, so you are still going to get some coverage there. He does throw hits. He does get blocks. But it hasn't been up to the rate that he normally is throughout the year. It's still down comparatively, and especially considering the physicality that the Flyers have, made a name for themselves this year. It's a bit underwhelming to see Provorov on the lower end of that list.
Yeah, Provorov, not the greatest defenseman right now. But in his past 4 games, he has 7 shots, 7 hits, 6 blocks. So like you're saying, some decent coverage there. Right now in your lineup, he's probably like a 5 or a 6, as far as your D is concerned. the lack of points, the lack of a lot of shots really prevents him from really being more than that. I mean, I would rather start Sandin than Provorov right now, even though Provorov has better peripherals, with the coverage there. He's just not getting the points, and it just does not make any sense to me whatsoever. So I also wouldn't, if I were to pick up one of these two guys, I would take a flyer on Bunting. I wouldn't touch Provorov. I'd take a flyer on Bunting, see if he can catch fire, in your sort of, spot that you got for waiver pickups, or just guys that you want to just, take Hail Marys on. He's definitely a guy who could contribute. But again, you don't really want to spend assets for either of these players. But some players that I might, consider spending some assets are some of my, prospect breakout candidates. And I got two guys here that I think are primed for fantastic NHL careers and are providing some value right now. They both have just gotten, kind of a cup of coffee, just kind of in the last couple of weeks here. And the first guy I'm going to talk about, William Eklund, the San Jose Savior, in his 5 games played this week, in his 5 games played since getting called up. He's got an assist. He's got 9 shots, 5 hits, 3 blocks. And this guy's been eating up time on ice. His average time on ice in those 5 games has been 19 minutes and 48 seconds. Okay. Power play time on ice, averaging 4 minutes and 5 seconds. Okay. This is the same power play. He's on the same unit as Carlson. Okay. Let's just let that sink in. Okay. The points aren't totally there right now, and the shots are getting there. He's close to 2 shots a game, which is good. You want to see at least that in these guys that are trying to make an impact. It's tough to make an impact as a forward, like we talked about earlier, if you're only taking a shot a game. Really tough to generate stuff with that. But I'm liking a lot of what I'm seeing here with Eklund. It's going to be interesting to see how things kind of play out rest of season, given the Sharks' position in the standings. Eklund probably will ride out the rest of the season with the Sharks, and we'll see if his ice time stays there. We'll see if his power play ice time stays there, and we'll see if he can kind of find a groove and work his way into some regular production. Jacob, you got anything on this Eklund guy?
Yeah, Eklund is just one of my favorite, again, overall prospects in the NHL. I won't hide it. I was one of the people during his draft year, which was 2021, that was talking, maybe Buffalo should think about taking him first overall. I really believe that he was that caliber of a player. Maybe not, right away, but I knew Buffalo had prospects in the system where I was like, they could take a player that would take you 1, 2, 3 years to really develop, but he would be someone that would mean a lot to their roster. So when he fell all the way to 7 to San Jose, I was a bit shocked that he didn't go top 5. I thought he was the type of player that could, but they got an absolute steal for the player that they nabbed there. And you're absolutely right. He's being given the opportunity to play and be an impact player in San Jose. He definitely outgrew the AHL this year. He was just being an absolute stud. 52 games, he had 41 points with 17 goals. So he definitely is of the caliber that he could have been brought up far earlier than he was. But San Jose was probably just in the mentality of, let the kid develop, let him play down there, because up here we're not winning a lot of games and you don't want to destroy a kid's confidence. But now that it's later in the year, you can bring up those prospects, especially since they traded out a bunch of players. So you got to fill those roles. So Eklund is definitely one that you're going to want to look at, keep an eye on, because he is one of the future pieces of San Jose. He's poised to be one of their top forwards for the next decade as soon as everything kind of starts to click for him. And he's a point producer. At the end of the day, he does play a 2-way game, but he is a point producer. So once he figures that out, you're going to want him on your team, because similar to Kulich, he does a little bit of everything. He gets shots, he gets hits, he scores goals, he gets assists, he can win draws, he can play center. So, he has all of the right tools for fantasy owners, and he's a lot closer than Kulich since he actually is playing in the NHL. And once he grows his game to become accustomed to that, pace of play, he's gonna. I'll say it now. He might even be in the Calder race for next year.
Oh, you heard it first here. Eklund, Calder favorite for next year. Book it in. Book it in. Everybody, place your bets. All right.
I called Beniers last year, so just saying.
There you go. There you go. You heard it here first. All right. The next guy, quickly touch on Luke Evangelista. This kid, he's been just beautiful so far. 6 games played, 2 goals, 2 assists for 4 points. Love that. He's getting production right away. That's fantastic. 14 shots, 4 hits, a block. So peripherals aren't quite there, but he's shooting, okay? He's got over 2 shots a game. That's beautiful, wonderful. 16 minutes and 7 seconds of average time on ice, 2 minutes and 11 seconds of power play time on ice. That's nice. There's room to grow there with his ice time, with his power play. He is playing in the top 6. Forsberg is injured. Surprise. And this is what you want to see from prospects. I know kind of what's been circulating lately is that Nashville really doesn't know what to do. It doesn't really know how to develop their prospects. There's a lot of guys who they just end up trading or go to the waivers and get picked up by other teams. And then those teams put them in positions to succeed, and then they succeed. So Nashville's drafting nicely, but they're not necessarily developing nicely. So it's nice to see one of their own homegrown guys getting some success early. So keep your eyes open for Luke Evangelista, especially for rest of the season, and because Forsberg just gets injured just by
every other week
looking at him sometimes. It's kind of ridiculous. So that's all the time that we have for the players that we're kind of taking a look at. Now we're going into our topic of the week, retooling versus rebuilding. Okay. It's kind of a big topic. We're going to kind of just give a bit of an overview and a bit of sort of the mentality that you should have if you're one of these teams, and the situations that you should consider a retool instead of a rebuild, and vice versa. Okay. So I'll just quickly start off by sort of defining these terms a little bit more for everybody here. So we can define what a retool and what a rebuild is by what assets they give up and what assets they acquire. So if you're retooling, you're trading out your older win now pieces for younger players rather than draft picks. And then if you're rebuilding, you're keeping your core, your young core, whoever you identify that as, and then you're selling everybody else for draft picks. That's the sort of general conception. There was a Twitter thread that I looked at recently. I would really like to give credit to this guy. He's got a Substack. Is Brett Lee on Twitter, and it's at BRETT1EE. Go check him out. He's got a whole Substack on this and sort of the different relationships between contenders, retoolers, and rebuilders. Okay, so Jacob, retooling versus rebuilding, what kind of situation should you consider a rebuild instead of a retool?
So one of the biggest differences between the two when it comes to retool versus rebuild, when you retool, it means you already have pieces in place. You already have some young players that are breaking out or are right on that cusp of breaking out, and you just need to give them a little bit of support. So when you retool, you're going to want to move out those, kind of older or underperforming players for some additional younger pieces that will continue to build that core as you kind of grow into a contender. Because at the end of the day, you do need a good combination of older performers and young performers, and then some role players to kind of round out your team. But all in all, your core should be that group of young players anywhere between ages like 22 to about 26, where they're really giving you the bulk of your points. Those players that are constantly throwing hits, those players that are constantly winning you draws, those young players that are throwing up big numbers of points. If they're breaking out scoring goals, that's an absolute bonus, but just scoring points in general is really what you're looking for. You can always find, additional goal support through those older players that are born much more further along and developed, because it's never a bad idea to have Alex Ovechkin on your team, type thing. So retooling is more about growing the support for the team you already have, as opposed to rebuilding, which is selling off all of the pieces that aren't growing for draft picks so that you can get those young players that are going to be ready in the next 1, 2, 3 years. Retooling is more of a 1 to maybe 2 year turnaround, as opposed to rebuilding where you're looking at 3, sometimes 4 years before your team is really ready to contend and start building towards, that fantasy championship. So I'd say that's the biggest difference, is the use of the young players and I don't want to say disposal, but the trading or movement of older players for younger assets to really push that team of yours to the next level, so you're ahead of everyone else and you have the ability to ultimately become a contending team where you're going to be trading picks. And that's the biggest difference between them.
Yeah, I think that was well said. The relationship between these three types of teams is also interesting as far as trading is concerned. When you're a contender, you're spending draft capital and in some cases prospects to acquire those older win now pieces, those guys who are consistent fantasy producers, but maybe they're older than 27 years old. Maybe some of them are 30 or whatever, but they are consistently putting up great numbers, and those are the guys that the contenders are going to want. So, and the contenders are getting those pieces from both retooling and rebuilding teams. Okay. So they're in full buy mode, right? Rebuilders, they're in full sell mode, right? They're trading their win now pieces and young NHLers who are not part of their identified core for draft picks. So they still might sell off some of those young players in that 22 to 26 age range, but it's only because it's not a type of player that they want, or they're limiting how many players they're going to keep in their core because they just really want to strip things down to the studs, right? And now retoolers, those teams are in a very unique position because they're doing a little bit of both. They're selling off, and that's part of what this thread that I mentioned earlier sort of goes into, is they're taking the draft capital and the assets that they get from trading their win now pieces to contenders. They're using that to then pick up those young NHLers from the rebuilding teams. So it's half sell, half buy. And they're just they're changing the mix and the DNA of their team to contend in that 1 to 2 year window, like Jacob said. And that's a very interesting sort of mindset to get into, so that's really the difference. And retooling isn't just selling a couple assets for young players. It's this mix of acquiring some assets to then spend to get other assets. And there's a beautiful sort of flow chart that's posted in this in this Twitter thread. And then they also give a great example of, an NHL team that at this past deadline executed this concept of retooling beautifully. And that was the Washington Capitals, right? They got rid of Orlov and Hathaway, both of those players 31 years old, and they got a first, a second, and a third for those players. And then they used that first plus another older player that they had, Eric Gustafsson, who's 30, to acquire Rasmus Sandin, 22 years old. Those are the kind of deals. That's that relationship in a nutshell. Those older players who are still very valuable to contending teams. Even in your fantasy leagues, Hathaway throws hits. Orlov has been, almost as good as Sandin. He's been almost as good as Sandin since the trade, and maybe even a little better. That's retooling right there. So there's a little bit of suffering right now for like next year. Now you're going to contend. Now you're freeing up space, maybe acquire some free agents or waiver wire guys who can really push your team to the next level. So, I think that's basically what you're looking at. And then your rebuild is like, I have a good core, but everything else is just a mess. So keep what's most important, sell everything else, and then you're probably looking at least like 3, maybe 4 years, depending on how you execute that rebuild. If you luck into some really fantastic trades where you get some young players instead of draft picks that more fit the mold, you can speed up your rebuild a little bit. Take a sort of a page from the retooler's handbook, and instead of just getting draft picks from the contenders, also getting those prospects who are, close to breaking out at the NHL level, or are just, 100 games in, maybe things haven't quite clicked. But once they get going, maybe a change of scenery, and those guys should be performing really well for you. Jacob, you got any more thoughts about rebuilding versus retooling as we close out the show here?
Yeah. So you might be sitting there wondering, how do I know if I'm a rebuilder? How do I know if I'm a retooler? What really is the thing that kind of separates two and makes me go, do I sell the farm or do I just sell off what I don't need type deal? And it really comes down to where you are in your standings. If you're sitting kind of on that bubble where you're like, maybe I could push, maybe I could tank, you're really a retooler, so you can kind of make that distinction for yourself based off of how has your team performed all year, and is it really worth making that push now? Can you really compete with those top end teams? You might want to think about retooling if the answer is no. If you say the answer is yes, Godspeed to you, good luck. But if you say no, retooling is usually your better option if you're in that middle of the pack. If you're towards that bottom half, those bottom 3-4 teams, depending on how big your league is, then rebuilding is really definitely something you should consider, depending, again, on how your team has performed. If it's just been a case of I've been slightly outperformed each week and everything is really close, you could still be in that retool phase, and you might just want to try and bank on some better luck for next season. That's absolutely the case. But if you're sitting towards the bottom and you're getting blown out week after week after week after week, you're going to want to really consider yourself a rebuild and just tear the whole thing down, start from scratch, and really get all of those draft capital and young pieces on your team so that you can build to become one of those middle to contending teams. So that's the biggest distinction, is where you are in the standings and how your team performs even when you're at the mid to bottom tier.
100%. And just to give one little quick thing as we close out, I made a couple trades. I'm a retooling team in my dynasty league. I'm in an 18 league, and I've been sitting 4th or 5th basically all season. So I'm in that middle of the pack. I don't quite have the juice to really kind of push to contend, but I could sell off some assets to acquire other assets that can make me still competitive in that range while building towards the future. And there's 2 trades that I made that I think kind of illustrate this. One trade, I traded Adam Fox to a contending team. I got Jacob Chikrin, Alexander Holtz, Ivan Miroshnichenko, and a 5th round pick. So Miroshnichenko and Holtz, they're definitely like in a couple of years, they could be, real contributors. But then I'm still getting a young defenseman who can get me hits and shots. He hits and shoots more than Fox. So right there, that's kind of a win for me right now. The points isn't totally necessary, but Chikrin still gets decent points. That's a nice slight retool example there. Just getting those assets for that win now piece. And the other trade that I made, I got rid of Alex Killorn, Brett Pesce, Matt Roy, Quentin Byfield, and a 1st round pick for Capo Caco, Rasmus Sandin, and a 7th round pick. So there was some value that I gave up there. That 1st round pick, yes, it's a deep draft, but where I would be picking, am I going to get a guy who's going to step into the NHL right away? Not really. I would have picked in the sort of 6 to 8 range. So I'm still getting a guy that I'm waiting a couple of years on, waiting for a couple of years just for them to make the NHL, let alone produce at the NHL. So that's why it was important for me to get Kakko and Sandin, because both of those guys are in the NHL right now. And as you can see, that Sandin trade has really paid some dividends for me, getting great production from him. Kakko, he's still a work in progress. We'll see if the Rangers keep him or if they ship him out. But these are the kind of deals that you're looking for to send those older players and those also slightly younger players who are a bit further away than what you would like for the players that are going to help you now or going to help you next year once they sort of reach their breakout. Jacob, that's unfortunately all the time that we have for our show today. So next week, we're going to talk about win now acquisitions for contending teams. What guys should you look at picking up if you're in the top 3 to 4 teams in your league? Okay, so stick around for that next week. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at THW Fantasy. I'm on Twitter at Caleb Scouting.
And I'm also on Twitter at Stroz67.
If you are watching on YouTube, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the Hockey Writers YouTube channel. If you're listening in podcast format, subscribe to the podcast and please leave us a review on whatever platform you listen to. You've been listening to the Hockey Writers Fantasy Forecheck. Keep your stick on the ice, get pucks in deep, and give it 110%, eh? I'll see you next week.